If there is one place where the progressives can still push their messaging across, largely unhindered from private society, it is schools. And with all the nonsense going on in American schools, you might be thinking that alternative educational arrangements might be a good idea for you or for your kids, like homeschooling, for example, or private tutors, or even just private school. Well, the government is moving in to clamp down on such things as freedom for your kids with its schools bill. And this has had relatively little media coverage, and I think it's really important because there's a lot that goes on in here, and I'm going to go through some of the main points as to why this is happening and why you should be concerned about it. So it's an outrageous infringement on the right of parents to home educate, fundamentally. That's why we need to be worried. Even if your kids are going to school and you have no intention of making other arrangements, it's bad news and it will affect you, especially if you're privately educated. I'm going to break down why that is and why you should be concerned. So basically, TLDR, the government believes now that it has the right to decide how your children are educated, and the parents are at best an inconvenience. So that might sound a bit hyperbolic, right? Well, we'll get into it, so just hold on to that for a second. We have Calvin posting here. The schools bill is atrocious. It's creeping nanny statism. The government has more to say over a child's education than their parents do. Schools should be supplementary. Education begins at home. The state should support parents, not replace them, which I think is reasonable. I agree with that. So let's jump down to Rhys Laverty here, and there's 18 points. So he received this forwarded message talking about the various parts of it, which is just a really good summary of what is included in this bill. So I'm going to read it so you can be informed. Under the bill, all schools must become academies. That's a certain type of school we have in Britain. I'll explain that later. New academies can only have state-provided sites, preventing any new church schools from being set up. School governance is decided by the Department for Education, who can remove and replace governors themselves. Worship and religious education arrangements can be changed or removed by Department for Education regulations. Trust schools lose the right to receive or buy extra land for the school. That's schools set up by trust. The Department for Education has the right to set the curriculum, not heads, not governors, not teachers. The Department for Education has the right to set school hours and term times. They have the right to set absence policies, removing the right of parents to obtain term time off from the head teacher for any reason. So just let that sink in. If you have to get time off for your kid, whether it's going on holiday, a death in the family, whatever it might be, you can't go to the head teacher and say, oh, by the way, blah, 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 I need to take little Timmy out for a day. No, you've got to get permission from the local authority, and that goes on the register and so on. And if you do that without the right permissions, you can be fined up to £120.
Sorry, and that goes all the way back to Westminster, the Department of Education, approving whether or not you can take little Timmy out.
You can, I believe, get it approved from the local authority, not Westminster. Okay. But still, that's the local council. So, and if you're fortunate enough never to have had any dealings with the local council, should we just say they are not the most reliable bureaucracy in the world? So also, the Department for Education sets the fines for absence, and as indicated, they'll be used punitively to prevent parents from having the temerity to take their children out of school. Right. Oh, bear in mind, we literally shut down schools for months and months during the pandemic lockdowns. And now the government's turning around and saying, well, actually, education at the time that a child spends in school is so important that even if you miss one day, we just have to fine you. You know, it's a bit of a double standard there, I think.
To punitively fine you as well.
Yeah.
We're going to try and absolutely ruin you because you took one day off.
Right. The Department for Education has the right to set admissions procedures, not the school. Admissions procedures are a really curious thing because our governments, whether Labour or Conservative, for years and years, for decades, have been very anti-selective admissions. There's kind of this idea that every school should be a melting pot, that you shouldn't have, say, schools which select for people who are talented at the things that the school wants to cultivate, for example. And this is why schools in Britain have been described as engines of equality, because they just try to shove everyone together regardless of their ability and don't really care about whether that's good for the children or what comes out the other end, so long as all of their metrics are met. So the Department for Education also sets teachers' salaries. It can ban teachers from teaching, not just in school, but also online and remotely. So if you've been banned from teaching, let's say you've had a political argument or fallen out with the board or so on, and you've been banned from teaching, you can't even tutor. You can't even find alternative employment in the private sector to teach. No, the Department for Education can just ban you. That's it. You cannot do that job anymore in this country, which is a little bit draconian, I think. The Department for Education also controls how the school spends money, completely removing autonomy from the proprietors of the school. So there's your financial independence as the school gone as well. Ofsted can seize any material from the school that it wants. Not complying will be a criminal offence. So they can literally come in and say, Gibbs, you have to give it to them. Now, obviously, this is understood in the framework of them investigating goings-on in schools, say radicalism, extremism, etc., etc. But still, that's deeply concerning. But now we get to the real meat of why this is really bad. The bill introduces a register of children who are not in school. Okay, so no matter who you are, your child needs to be on this register. So before, you had the right to educate your own children, and you can send them to a school as you wish, which is what most people did because there are many efficiency arguments. It gives you time off so that you're not spending your whole day teaching your children, etc., etc. And so most people go to school. There's an estimated, I think, 60,000 children homeschooling, last I heard. Now, every single one of those children needs to be on a register. This is a little bit creepy. If your child takes a day off for an appointment, you will have to register with your local authority. So if you take a day off school, you also need to be on a register. That goes back to not being able to get clearance from the head teacher. You have to go to the local authority. You will be under a duty to supply your local authority with any information that it demands of you under threat of fines or imprisonment if you fail to do so or even make a clerical error in doing so. So, okay, now the local authority is just empowered to make unreasonable demands and requests and intrusions into your privacy simply because you have a child or you're trying to home educate. Right? This is not in the social contract. This is not in the deal that we signed with a government that we exist, we pay our taxes, you leave us alone. No, it doesn't end there. The government's coming for you. And as I said before, fines of up to £120 for each day off school that hasn't been cleared by the local authority. It gets worse. If you use a tutor or out-of-school classes, the service provider will be under a duty to provide your child's details to the local authority. Okay, so your tutor has to dob your kid into the local authority so your kid gets on the register and blah, 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 and they harvest information about your child's education that way. Right. So again, tutor is just someone trying to do a job, teach some kids, get paid, act as a normal economic actor. No, according to this schools bill, they are now an agent of the state and they are required to dob you in.
That's just weird.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Why indeed? We carry on. This is where it gets really mental, okay? If a family member educates your child with special needs or educates 5 children or more for some of the time, they will have to register as a school and face Ofsted inspection and the duties that schools have to provide your information to the local authority. Right, let's just let that sink in, okay? So say you have 5 children, right? And you want to home educate them. Well, you have to register as a school. You are now a school. And you have to be investigated as such. You have to file your paperwork like a school. You have to be investigated by Ofsted as a school. And you can fail that inspection as well. So that is really creepy. But the main thing that this completely destroys is homeschooling communities. So if you have, say, a street and there are 4 families on there, say, each one has a child or 2, and suppose they take it in turns, take one day off and do the teaching for the day, or whatever it is, some arrangement like that. Well, under these rules, every single family on that street that's engaged in this project would have to register as a school, every single household. So just to educate these 5 children from 4 different families, you need to register 4 schools, and each one of those households then has to submit paperwork as a school to do this. Like, can you see how absolutely mental this is?
I mean, I imagine no one's been consulted about that aspect. I mean, I don't know. I mean, how big is homeschooling even in the UK? I mean, I don't know.
So last I checked, last figure that I'm aware of is about 60,000 in 2019, but it's been going up strongly, partly because of the sort of things we cover going on in schools. But 60,000 children is not actually a lot of children. And a lot of these homeschooled children are not going to be permanently homeschooled. They're going to be homeschooled for a year or two while they've got some kind of educational difficulties or whatever it may be. And then they'll go back into the school system, maybe to get qualifications or whatever it may be. So it's not like we have an absolute chronic problem of homeschooling or even academic underachievement from homeschoolers, right? There is no problem here that they are fixing. They are just destroying the entire landscape, laying waste to the landscape of home education simply because, well, they're idiot bureaucrats and they want control.
I mean, that's what this is always about.
Mm-hmm. But it gets worse. Any setting which provides education to 5 children or more will have to register as a school with no exceptions made, not for childminders, not for tutors. So tutors would have to register as a school, not for after-school clubs or forest schools or large families who home educate. So it's looking like after-school clubs will have to register as schools, which is just mental. If that is how this comes through, and there's a number of amendments being looked at, then that will be utterly Kafkaesque. And finally, the bill takes away your right to remove your child from a school without the oversight of your local authority, regardless of how that authority has already failed your child. So if you want to take your child out of school, the local authority basically has to clear it and say, yep, your paperwork's in order, your register's fine, we give our permission, etc., etc. You can't. So if your child's been abused at school by incompetent teachers, bullies, or is just depressed by the whole prison-like experience, you can't just say, you can't do anything unilaterally. You have to have the permission of the local authorities. And this is a huge change because up until now in this country, in Britain, we've always had the right to educate our own children. And now what this bill is doing is it's turning that presumption on its head. The presumption is you don't have the right unless you can provide paperwork satisfactorily and get all the right permissions and so on. It's the creeping invasion of bureaucracy into civic life. And that they summarise that quite well here. What this bill does to you is take away your right as a parent to choose the education for your child and give that right to faceless civil servants in the Department for Education who do not know your child. The school bill places all education provisions under the control of the Department for Education and local authorities, with no exceptions. And one reason why this may not have been reported on quite so much is, if we go to the next one, that there's actually quite a lot to go into. If we scroll down through all of these policy statements, there's a lot to actually wrap your head around. There's like pages and pages and pages and pages, and it's all split up into different bits and questions and so on. But you can find all of the information there. I'm leaving that in there. So if you do want to get to the heart of it, then it's all there for you. Moving on to the next one, a load of ex-ministers have lined up to criticise this. I'll quote from 2 in particular. Lord Baker, the Education Secretary between 1986 and 1989, warned that the bill increases the powers of the Secretary of State and the Department for Education in a way unprecedented since 1870. It's a real grab for power by the Department for Education, he warned. You must remember that the DFE since 1870 has never run a school. Now they're going to take complete control over the education system, and so I think they should be watched. This is a really game-changing bill of a very significant nature, and I think it's totally unproved that the DFE actually knows very much about the improvement of schools. It's a very good point he puts there, isn't it?
Well, I didn't know they hadn't run a school since, what was that, 1870?
Well, yeah, they don't. The schools are run by governors and trustees and teachers and head teachers. But the Department for Education is more of an oversight board. It doesn't actually own any schools of its own in the sense that it runs them themselves. If you're a civil servant in the Department for Education, I suspect that the probability you've ever taught a class of children is going to be quite low. You'll be a career civil servant. God help us. The government has set a target for all schools to be in academy trusts or in the process of moving into them by 2030. There's a load of ex-ministers who complained, a lot of them from a very Labour perspective, where they're saying it doesn't go far enough. Government needs more power. It's like,
Why?
Doesn't matter. They just
Yeah,
need more
just
power.
power for power's sake.
Be all socialism. Lord Knight also spoke out against this. Now, he served as schools minister in the Blair and Brown Labour government, so we can't exactly expect a dyed-in-the-wool Tory here. But he said the government had identified the right problem with academy agreements and a multitude of contracts between the Education Secretary and academies. So the system is quite complicated at the moment. Michael Gove set up a load of free schools and academies starting from 2010, 2011, and now it is true, it's a very Byzantine system of what's a school, what's an academy, what type of school is it compared to before. So that is perhaps overcomplicated, but this is a real blunt instrument if that's the problem to solve. And that's what he says. But the solution is draw dropping. Draw dropping, goodness me. My earpiece is catastrophically malfunctioning. It's putting off my reading, so I'm going to take that out. Making the solution is jaw-dropping, making the Secretary of State effectively the Chief Education Officer for 25,000 schools. They're not going to be in office forever. Do they really want to give future Secretaries of State the power to do what on earth they like to schools in this country? Because that's what this bill allows them to do. I mean, I don't really care if they want to give that power or not. I don't want to give them that power. I think the voters are the ones from whom the power is being taken. It's the voters over whom the power is being wielded. We're the ones who should be involved in this. Just a quick bit on academies so I can explain them. So this is one of the reasons they give in the next article. Why is becoming an academy so important? We have a decade of evidence that academy trusts can transform underperforming schools. We want all schools to be part of a strong academy trust so they can benefit from the trust's support in everything from teacher training, curriculum, financial planning, and inclusivity towards children with additional needs to excellent behaviour and attendance cultures. So again, inclusivity is just rearing its ugly head in the background there. Now, there are a couple of petitions I want to draw your attention to. So one of them is on change.org. This already has 85,000 signatures now, and that clearly shows there's significant popular interest in this issue, despite the fact that no one is really reporting on it. No one is telling you that this is a massive power grab of your rights. You know, BBC, ITV, Guardian, Telegraph, a few articles here and there, but nothing really getting at the case. And then there's one also on petition.parliament.uk. This one only has 5,000 signatures. This is the important one because if you get enough signatures on this, they will actually debate this in Parliament.
Or give you a government response, which may be laughable at times, but at least gives you something to laugh at and an insight into how incompetent some of the government ministers are. Yeah,
so it's all well and good having and this sadly only addresses a small part of the bill rather than the whole thing. However, the change.org petitions, they're okay as a barometer for, people are concerned about this, but they're functionally useless. If you really want a proper petition, you want to do it through Parliament so there can be an actual parliamentary debate about it, and then you can say, right, we've properly brought this to the attention of the government, whether or not they respond to it. But that can be useful for lawmakers like Lord Knight, who are trying to push back on aspects of this bill. Yes, I did have a little explainer lined up on the British school system. This just illustrates just how complicated it is. So there are community schools, which are also local authority maintained schools, which are state schools. There are foundation schools and voluntary schools, which are funded by the local authority. There are academies and free schools, which are run by not-for-profit academy trusts, are independent from the local authority and allegedly have more freedom to run how they run their education and follow the curriculum. And then there are grammar schools, which can also be run by a local authority, a foundation body, or an academy trust, which have an academic selection principle. So there's quite a lot.
Thank you, Sir Humphrey.
I just remember it being, basically it's state schools and then there's grammar schools and state comprehensive. And I'm not saying that was a good system, but at least it was an easy to understand system. And there are also special schools for people with special educational needs. So let's look at academies in particular, because that's the one they're trying to make all schools this type of school. Academies receive funding directly from the government and are run by an academy trust. They have more control over how they do things than community schools. Community schools, by the way, are not actually run by the community. They're run by the local authority, the council. So it's a bit of a misnomer. academies have more freedom and more autonomy. They do not charge fees. They are inspected by Ofsted and have to follow the same rules on admissions, special educational needs and exclusions as other state schools, and students sit the same exams. Academies have more control over how they do things. For example, they do not have to follow the national curriculum, hurrah, and can set their own term times. Also interesting. And that's useful for, say, religious schools or slightly internationally focused schools that want to adhere to a certain calendar. Some schools choose to become academies. If a school funded by the local authority is judged as inadequate by Ofsted, then it must become an academy. Now, academies are a really curious experiment. So it's not all that academies bad. Academies were actually set up by Gove during his time as Education Secretary, and they're an experiment in a free market vision of schooling. So the idea is that you have lots of different types of education, all these different academies. Each one of them has more autonomy to be a different type of school. And the idea is that gives more choice to parents to choose to send their children to a school that will benefit their child's education. And it gives more autonomy to teachers to plan out the type of education that they think will be good for the world and for the children under their care. So that actually is a really interesting idea. However, they call them free schools, and I think that's a misnomer. It's a bit like a free prison, if you ask me. For me, a free school would be a school in which children can direct their own learning rather than be subject to a curriculum. So like a Montessori school or something like that, or even homeschool. However, neither academies nor free schools are allowed to have selective admissions processes, i.e. having to pass an academic test to get in. So they're not meritocratic in that way. There's one small exception, which is academies that converted to academies having previously been grammar schools or had some kind of selective admissions policy. And I actually do think you need selective admissions policies if you want schools that are going to produce excellence in any direction. Of course, the mission of our schools is not to produce excellence, it's to produce equality. And I've written on this at the Lotus Eaters as well. You can find this, The Meaning of an Education, where I talk about what's actually important when we talk about education. And the second one is about how schools can be bad from an institutional angle rather than just in terms of bad teachers or bad implementation. And that's what I wanted to talk about today.
Thanks for watching this segment of the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed that, you can subscribe and find our premium content at lotuseaters.com. For instance, Rory has recently done a review of Top Gun Maverick, and if you're interested in finding him on social media, you can follow him on Getter at Rory Lotus Eaters. Thank you and goodbye.